Those of you that truly believe you have seen a cryptid, Bigfoot, Jersey Devil, etc. What's your story? 1. I was on a ferry for a school softball trip off Kodiak Island, AK, 2014. I was 18. A whole bunch of us had snuck up to the deck around 11 p.m. to watch the waves and smoke cigarettes and weed and generally be teenagers on a boat without supervision. It was 11 p.m. in May in Alaska, so the sun was thinking about setting, but it was still pea bright outside. So we're just doing our thing. And we notice a pod of orcas swimming with the ferry's wake, which is versus cool but not, like, unusual. If you're familiar with the dimensions of an orca fin, you know they're about 4 to 6 feet in height and look like big black spikes coming out of the water. They travel and hunt in pods of anywhere between 15 to 40 whales. Apex predators, the beautiful demon murderers of the sea. Total assholes, top of the food chain. So we saw a pod of orcas, counted them to be around 10 to 15, with some babies scattered in there. Very fun to watch, took them a good 30 minutes to all go by. We tried to get pictures, but it was just dark enough that our shitty phone cameras weren't much good. Another 30 or 40 minutes go by and we've all peed much sobered up, and it's about to get dark and we're cold and sleepy and about ready to go in. No more orcas, haven't seen one for like half an hour, and then one of my JV girls spots another one. So we all turn and look. But one dorsal fin is immediately followed by another, and another, and another, and then 2 more, and then 2 more after that, in 2 separate rows. And they're taller, by a lot, and jagged, like some have whole chunks torn out of them. And they're all 8 to 10 feet high, and they're all attached to one creature, and we can just barely see its back slicing through the water, covered in these rows of spikes, and it just keeps coming. This thing is like 20 or 30 feet from the ferry, running parallel to it. And we are all transfixed. There's like 9 or 10 of us, and no one is saying a word because we've all turned to look at a whale. And we are all now watching something that is like horrifically, terrifyingly, obviously not a whale. Someone tries to take a picture, but it's too dark at this point, and the only reason we can see this thing is the light cast from ferry portholes. Take as old as time when it comes to things that you really fucking wish you had a picture of. But we all stand there completely scared, fucking stiff, and in awe. And we watch this thing just keep surfacing for a good 6 or 7 minutes, which means that whatever it was long, like 60 or 70 feet long, or longer, and covered in enormous spikes that looked like they'd won thousands of battles with God knows what. It took what felt like an eternity for any of us to say anything after the last of it disappeared back into the strait. I mean, if you and like 8 of your friends had just all seen something that all science had definitely pointed to not existing, and you had all seen the same exact thing, and it was very obviously trailing, nay, hunting, not 1 but 15-something apex fucking predators, what do you even say to break that silence? That's the thing that eats me about the whole thing, is it was hunting. It was following them. It was literally hunting about 60 tons of toothy, angry, intelligent apex predator. Every once in a while, one of us will hit another one of us up and check in, like, do you remember this? Was I hallucinating? Did we all see the same insane, worldview melting, terrifying thing that night? And the reason I know we did is BC, none of us talked about it after that. Not during the trip, not after, not to any of our friends. BC, how the fuck do you even tell someone about something like that? Now we have almost 10 years between us, and that night, I assume some of them have probably told people. I know I tell people, because I've seen a lot of shit like that in Alaska, and I'm that bitch. And also BC, there's a very rich history among native Alaskans of a something that lives and hunts in the waters around Kodiak, and it's important to tell its story. BC, someday it's going to eat a little too much plastic and no one will ever watch it hunt a pod of orcas from a boat ever again. 2. After my father passed away, I went to live with my friend and his mom for a little while. Things with my mom were very strained and I didn't want to stay at my friend's house initially, but they didn't want me alone during that time. Staying at anyone's house always made me feel uneasy for some reason. My first night there, early in the morning I woke up to the sound of my bedroom door opening and a gentleman wearing a red flannel and bib denim overalls came into my room holding a bag of tools. He turned the light on, looked at me, and walked through another doorway to the utility room. Soon after, I fell asleep again, but when I woke up this time, room was dark. Everything was the same when I went to sleep the night previously. Figuring, I imagined the whole thing. I went upstairs for coffee and asked my friend's mom if the guy with the overalls is still here. With a weird look, she informed me that it's been her and I in the house all night. At this point, I'm very confused. So I explained detail about what the man looked like. Height, weight, clothes, facial hair, everything. She turns pale white and bolts to her room and retrieves a photo. When she shows me the photo, It's the man I saw in the basement that morning, even wearing the same clothes. She tells me that he passed away 30 years ago. It was her grandpa who owned the property previously. He had killed himself to save the farm when he invested his money into horses instead of machines, and his investment flopped. To keep the bank from taking the farm, on a stormy night he took a lightning rod into the middle of a pond and nature took his life when lightning struck the rod. Because of this, life insurance paid out, and his suicide saved the family diary and kept the house from being foreclosed on. 3. Working on ships. Some are pretty old and you hear some weird stories. 4 years ago during a South American season, I used to hang out with the Brazilians, fun and cool people. One was the gift shop manager. He'd rant about how his team is lazy and how they keep trying to weasel out of working because they claim to see a little girl running around the gift shop. One night we were having coffee with the head of the photography department and he's extra salty, talking about how he'll have to do an extra couple of hours because of his team. In the middle of the night, I get a call from the photo manager. She tells me our friend is in her cabin crying and shivering. I run over, thinking he got some bad news from home or something. Turns out he was working in his office. The door faces a long mirror that covers most of the wall, clothes section, and after hearing giggling, he saw the shadow of a child through the reflection, as if she was leaning to look into the door while trying to hide. Only in the reflection, he says he jumped up and ran out. The giggling and sounds of tiny feet running around the shop and into the casino, same deck. I'm not big into the paranormal, but the following day I mentioned this to my boss and she told me that about 20 years back, a little girl came out of the theater with her parents. She was running ahead of them, around the gift shop, but eventually she went into the casino, coming out at the atrium, a drop with glass lifts that go from deck 12 to 5, so a good drop. She leaned over the railing to look down, lost her balance and fell, breaking her neck on impact and dying. Apparently it was a common sighting at the shop and casino. 4. I was working at a summer camp in the PNW one year. On the second or third night there, I was jogging alone back from the staff campfire to the cabin, where the campers and my co-counselor slept. I'm walking in this big grassy throughway that has some taller reeds separating it from a shore of the Puget Sound. It's probably 2 a.m. full moon. As I'm jogging, I see this person in the reeds. It's wearing a white gown, and it has no face, just hair. I only notice it because, as I approached it, it stood up from a crouched position, backed up joltily a few steps, then crouched down again. But I could still see it crouching there, like it was waiting. Its movements told me that it was not human. My knees gave out, and I felt flooded with fear as I collapsed. I tried to run back to my cabin, but my legs would not work. I crawled and scrambled there on all fours. I tried to scream, but no sound came out, just gasping. I finally got to my cabin and fumbled with the doorknob for what felt like a minute before I could open it. I closed the door and stood there waiting for a while inside. I didn't hear anything, but I barely slept. At some point later that night, I remember laughing, thinking, oh, it was just one of the campers peeing. I was hysterically laughing at myself for like 20 minutes, then fell asleep. Next morning though, I realized that no campers returned to the cabin that could have potentially been out there peeing that night. I asked all of them, and all of them said they hadn't gone out to pee the previous night. I'll add that this was a camp that was overtly for non-religious, skeptically minded staff and campers, of which I was and still largely am, but I have no explanation for what I saw that night. Still scares the shit out of me just typing this. 5. One day my wife came home. We were living in an apartment in Midtown. It's about 10 p.m. and I was taking the trash to the dumpster in the alley behind my complex. The complex had only 6 two-story apartments, the front door of each facing south. We lived in number 5. And if you were to walk outside, once you open the door, there's a little raised landing where you'd put a welcome mat, step off the landing, you're on a walkway, and you have to go either left or right because there's a very tall wooden fence separating the complex from the large house next door. So if you turn right and walk down past apartments number 4 to 1, you run into a gate, go through a gate, and you're now on one of the main streets in Midtown. If you were to turn left coming out of the apartment, you will pass apartment number 6, then the laundry room, and immediately into a wrought iron gate, and immediately on the other side is the dumpster. It's a very short distance from my door to the dumpster, and with nothing to obstruct your view, you can see from the dumpster all the way down the length of the walkway to the gate at the other end of the complex. The entire area is well lit. Literally every unit would turn their front porch light on every night, and there is a street light right where the dumpster is. and one right on the other side of the street side gate. So it was easy to see my wife open the gate and head up the walkway towards our apartment. I waved at her and have no idea how she didn't see me, and I thought about yelling but didn't want to scare her or startle the neighbors. I was done emptying the garbage, so I just started walking the short distance to her. As I'm walking up, I see the door to our apartment open. Of course, I figured she opened it, but it was dark, so I didn't actually see her do it. Then she kind of leans in, and I could hear her calling my name, but she would not walk in to the apartment, our own apartment, so why not walk right in, right? Then, when I got behind her and said hi, she became frantic, asking me, "How the fuck did you do that? How did you get back outside?" I explained I'd been at the dumpster emptying the trash, to which she interrupted me, said, "No, you opened the door for me and walked upstairs. I called after you and you turned your head and looked at me, but didn't say anything and just kept walking." And then she started crying. I searched the apartment. Found nothing. We moved about 6 months later to the house we're at now. One day shortly after we moved in, my wife thought she saw me walk past the windows that look into the backyard from the kitchen. But it wasn't me, and again she said it looked just like me, and that it walked all the way around the house before disappearing, and then she realized I was in the bedroom. Creepy stuff 6. When I was in high school, I worked as a courtesy clerk at Albertsons. People were always telling me that they saw me somewhere in town when I wasn't there. One day when I got out of class at the end of school, I had to go straight to work. I wouldn't get home until just after 9 o'clock that night. So I walked in just after 9 o'clock and said, "Hi, people," to my mom and my sisters, and they all looked confused. My mom asked me where I was coming from. I said I had been at work. My mom and my older sister both said, "No, you haven't. You came in hours ago, said hi, people, and went upstairs." I said, "No, I didn't. I hadn't been home since I left at 7 o'clock this morning." So we all four went upstairs to my room to see who came home. My door was closed. I usually leave it open. The light was on and the TV was on. Open the door. No one there. But wait. It gets weirder. In high school, we had a secondary school called the Skill Center. It was a place that had a collection of vocational classes you could take. For instance, I took TV broadcasting, web design, and forestry. One day I was waiting for the bus to leave the Skill Center after my broadcasting class, and a teacher I never met ran up to me and said, "Zushiba, you need to come back to class." I had never been in her class, but apparently I had been missing for the last few seasons. I tried to explain I wasn't in her class, but she did seem to know who I was, so she took me to the office, thinking I was ditching. We go in and I tell the office clerk my name, and she looks me up. Sure enough, there I am in broadcasting, just like I said. But there I am, under my stepdad's last name in her class. I went by both names. It was a bit confusing, but both names were relatively unique. So it's not like there would have been a random person that looks just like me in her class. It's just extremely unlikely. I had been in her class for the entire semester, until I mysteriously stopped showing up. I had turned in work and everything, even had my goddamn signature on it. One day, this doppelganger simply stopped showing up. No one ever saw him again. 7. This was back in the late 90s, when myself and 2 of my friends were staying at their vacation home down on one of the local rivers. The house, think 3 small bedrooms, a sitting room/kitchen, and a small external bathroom, is on a privately owned island, not theirs, which is used for cattle grazing, and is about 3 to 4 square/miles in area. It is accessible by only one dirt road, which takes all of about 30 minutes to travel down, as it bends and winds through dense cypress swamps, full of alligators, and marsh plains. Along the road there is one other house, just as you get onto the island, which has long been abandoned. This old 2-story plantation-style home was supposedly abandoned when the owners, a married couple, child, suffered a fatal accident, and they couldn't stand being there anymore. Aside from my friend's house, the cattle farmer's home, and one other vacation home, the abandoned property is the only other structure. Well, my friends and I were out on the dock doing some night fishing, trying to land a shark or something to throw on the grill, but we hadn't had much luck. The river was as smooth as glass, which was really unusual. Because of where the dock is, the current there is usually very strong, even during the tide shift. We sat and chatted, waiting for a bite, up until about 11 p.m. Then off to our right, towards the coast, we heard a loud tone, or wail, which sounded like a mix between a ship's horn and maybe a wolf howl or something similar. An important note, the island is, by car, nearly an hour from deep water access, and probably more from actual ocean, so the likelihood that the sound was a large ship is low. So anyway, we are startled by the sound, and even my friend, who had been spending his summers there since he was in diapers, had never heard the noise before, and was bothered by it. So we decided to pack it in, since we weren't catching anything anyway, and had nearly gotten all our equipment back to the house when my second friend heard it. Coming from down the road, back towards the island access, was what sounded either like a cat meowing, or a child crying. We all stood in silence listening and trying to figure out what it was and where it was coming from. After listening for about 5 minutes, we decided to hop in the truck and drive down the road a ways with the windows down so we can try and find what was making the sound. What started out sounding like a cat was made clear as we got further up the road. That was not the case. We could clearly hear a child, and it sounded like it was saying, "Help me." We drove very slowly, calling out, and we'd wait a few minutes and hear, "Help me" again, but always further up the road, towards the swamps and the old abandoned house. We were seriously freaked out, because if there was a kid out there, why would they be going away from our calls and light into the swamp? We nearly made it all the way to the abandoned house when the sound just stopped. We waited for nearly an hour and never heard it again. We marked it up as nerves and headed back to the river house, assuming it had been an animal after all, and that we were probably just imagining it saying words. Well, after we had gotten back inside and settled in for the night, we started hearing it again. But as time passed, it came closer to us. We went out and called out again, and the sound would come closer. This went on for hours. Well, we decided we would try one more time to see if there was a kid lost or something. Again, important to note, we are miles from the next nearest people, and the noise sounded like a child, think 4-year-old. But once we got out in the truck again, the noise stopped. It's now nearly 3 in the morning, and we had been out in the sun fishing and swimming all day, so we were all tired. And after driving around a bit, calling out again, with no luck, we decide to give up. We get back inside again and get into our beds. Then we hear it, clear as a bell, "Help me," right outside the house. But it sounded so strange, like it was an echo, if that makes sense. Like it was close but far away too. Unlike hell if any of us were brave enough to go commando and leave the house. But we went out onto the porch, which was screened in for bugs, and listened. As soon as we went out, it would stop, go back into the beds. It would call out again, but in a different location outside the house. It circled the house, calling. All night, we all slept in the living room. But to be honest, there wasn't a lot of sleeping happening. In the morning, we went out and looked for tracks around the house, as the foundation is basically sand. There wasn't a mark, no prints, animal or otherwise. And to the best of my knowledge, this never happened again to my friend or any other visitors. To this day, we don't know what we heard, but it's probably the most supernatural occurrence I've experienced. 8. I'm normally pretty logical about seeing weird things. I work nights and go long periods of time without sleeping, so my mind playing tricks isn't super unusual. But this happened in broad daylight with other people around, and it has left me completely confused as to what happened. I was repairing a condenser in a very standard-looking suburban neighborhood. Directly across the street was a mother playing in her driveway with her toddler, pushing him around in one of those plastic cars. I was walking back to my work van around the side of the house when I hear a shriek, like a noise that you hear and know something is being hurt. I took a very quick few steps to clear the corner of the house and see what was happening. Mother across the street didn't seem to notice or hear or care. That's when I heard it again, but being in front of the house, I could pinpoint it a little better. My head snapped to the house directly to the right of the one the mother was out front of, and I saw a small child staring directly at me with its mouth wide open and eyes that seemed to be completely black all the way around its eye socket. I looked at the mother, sure she had to notice or at least hear the commotion. She didn't. The thing waved, not like in a come here motion, but more so acknowledging its awareness of me. I walked slowly back to the condenser and hid for maybe 5 minutes. When I came back around, it was gone, and the mother was carrying on like nothing had happened. I had no explanation for what happened, and still don't. When I went home and began to tell my girlfriend what had happened, she told me about black-eyed children. I don't know what I saw that day, but there was something so deeply upsetting about the entire situation. I'm happy calling it a cryptid if it means I'll never see them again. 9. I've shared these stories before, but I'm going to omit the story of what my buddy and I call a sea squatch, under the assumption it was an insanely huge turtle, even though I personally have never seen a turtle with a shell 6 feet across covered in barnacles, especially not in water that was 10 feet deep, and focus on old red eyes. For the sake of explaining it, from the only time I've ever seen it mentioned in writing beyond myself, Old Red Eyes is a ghost of a person, either black or Native American, that died in their task of helping slaves and escapees reach a safe haven. Their duties possibly included misleading, harassing, and, if necessary, killing any pursuers. Given the aggressive nature of the spirit, their most striking, and only, feature is the pair of piercing, glowing, scarlet orbs evenly spaced that float roughly between 6 to 7 feet in the air. They will occasionally blink out and reappear somewhere else, usually 10 feet or so away, as if they're stalking you. Now onto the story. All parts of this story take place at a friend's house that was already known as weird. The first half is secondhand and occurs roughly 15 years ago, well before we could drive ourselves. at that friend's birthday party. There's a lot of us, and I no longer remember the total number, but it was at least 8, quite possibly above 10. 3 or 4 of them decide they don't want to hang out in the hot basement and opt to go jump the fence that separates the house property from the rest of his property and run down the old riverbed. They leave, and maybe 5 to 10 minutes later, I'm hot too and grab a soda and head up to the landing, which has a view of both stairways in the house and also the part of the property my buddies have gone off to. Not long after, those who went off to romp in the night come back screaming and pile over the fence, and his otherwise quiet dogs begin going insane. I pop the door open for them because that's easier than dealing with an electronic lock, and they stop out of breath on the front porch. A couple of buddies come up the stairs having heard the ruckus and were treated to the tale of how they were fucking about when all of a sudden one of the bamboo bunches out there began to clatter and shake violently, shoots snapping and breaking, and some being hurled at them. We call bullshit and tell them to fuck off, get them some sodas, and leave it be. Eventually, they work up the nerve to go again. But this time, 2 new people decide to go with them. One of the people who was on the first run sits out, and they're bringing one of the dogs, though it takes a bit longer. They prop the gates open for the dog to squeeze through, and off they go into the woods. My buddy, who swore they were attacked by something, sits out on the front porch, as do I and another friend. 4 of them were out in the woods, and there was at least one person downstairs in the basement uninterested. We're talking trash about them while the only person who was out there defends the lot of them. Not too long after, 10 minutes tops, we hear a loud scream. The dog sets off, setting off the other dogs, and here they come piling over the fence, the dog worming through the gates like a pro. The story's a bit different this time. They couldn't shake the feeling of being watched once they got beyond able to see the lights of the house. Eventually, something made the dog growl, and they turned and saw what looked to be a pair of eyes, over 6 feet off the ground and burning scarlet, glaring at them. And then they blinked, and were gone, only to show up a few long strides to the right, then again, and again. And with a creeping dread, they realized that whatever it was slowly, gently, positioning itself between them and the house. This is what made them scream and bolt back to perceive safety. And quite safely this time. Although we called bullshit, again, a couple years later I found myself staring down the same burning red eyes over the roof of my car, staring into the front door, and in one case, staring me down before I could even crank my vehicle. While my encounters weren't as terrifying, they were still bad, and to this day, let me just say, absolutely fuck that.